After 70, this is why you lose friends. Have you ever noticed that after you hit 70, your phone rings less, and that Friday night dinner invitations seem to dwindle? I sure have. It's like one day you're swapping stories about the grandkids over coffee, and the next you're staring at an empty couch wondering where everybody went. All right. I remember just last month I sat on my porch in Jacksonville, Florida, watching the sun slip down behind the oaks and thinking, what happened to all my buddies? Right, you might chalk it up to busy schedules or folks getting caught up in their own lives, but there's a deeper reason we lose friends as we step into our 70s. And yes, I found it all laid out in Suni Levin's book, Make New Friends, Live Longer. She isn't just spouting opinion. She's an educator who's poured through decades of research showing that social ties can literally extend our lives. It turns out that when we get isolated, our health takes a nosedive. All right, but why does this isolation happen? And more importantly, what can we do about it? So, in today's chat, we're going to talk about the first couple of reasons why our circle shrinks after 70. And I'll share a couple of tried and true ways to reach out and keep those connections alive, okay? If you're new here on Elders Life, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. First off, let's talk about the biggest factor of all, peer attrition. I'm talking about those Monday morning coffee buddies who just don't show up anymore because they've passed on. I lost my fishing pal George 2 years ago in San Diego, and I felt a hole so big I thought I'd sink right in. Suni Levin points out that when spouses and longtime friends die, our social fabric unravels. Suddenly, there are empty chairs at the table, and all those shared memories feel bittersweet. Here's what helped me. Instead of waiting for someone else to call, I started sending out handwritten notes. Yep, real snail mail letters with stamps and everything. I'd jot down a favorite memory, like the time George and I almost capsized that little bass boat, and ask how their grandkids are doing. It sounds old-fashioned, but folks love it. A few weeks ago, I got a letter back from my neighbor, Martha, who lives 2 blocks down in the cul-de-sac. Hit the subscribe, meanwhile, and long drives leave me worn out. When you can't get out as easily, you stop popping over to neighbors' houses or joining that church lunch group. Levin emphasizes that we older folks often underestimate how much our shrinking radius cuts us off from the world. So, what's the easy fix? Start small. You don't have to trek halfway across town to reconnect. Maybe there's a church bingo night down the street or a book club meeting at the library just a mile away. I started by setting a tiny goal. Attend one community event a month. Last month, I showed up at the senior center's art class. Thought I'd be the worst painter there. But I bumped into Earl from my bowling league days, and we laughed all afternoon over our joint watercolor disaster. Okay. That little outing turned into a weekly tradition for us, and suddenly my calendar had a bright spot again. If getting out is really hard, say, if you're wheelchair-bound or dealing with serious health issues, Levin suggests using technology. I know some folks shy away from computers, but even a 5-minute video chat on a tablet can do wonders. Ask a grandchild or neighbor to show you how. Last winter, my cousin in Chicago gave me a crash course over the phone, and now we share a virtual cup of coffee on Sundays, right? That weekly habit keeps both of us smiling. All right, we've unpacked why we lose friends to grief and mobility shifts, And we've covered 2 straightforward ways to keep those connections alive: handwritten notes, small local gatherings, and even a little tech magic. Now that we've talked about why friends fade away and how to reach out when getting out feels tough, let's jump on to our next point about keeping old friendships fresh. You know, it's one thing to revive a friendship, but it's another to keep it from slipping away again. Soon 11 calls this the maintenance mindset, and I tell you, it's easier than you might think. Here's the thing: as we settle into our 70s, we often assume that old friends will always be there, like that trusty rocking chair on the porch. But life keeps shifting, and if we're not intentional, those bonds loosen. So I made myself a promise. Every month, I'll plan a little get-together, even if it is just a chat over iced tea in the backyard. Last Friday, I invited 3 neighbors, Helen, Joe, and Rosa, to sample my famous peach cobbler recipe. We hadn't all sat around the same table since last summer's block party. We laughed, we swapped stories about grandkids in Nashville and Phoenix, and by the end of the afternoon, we'd carved out a new tradition. Okay. Another trick Levin highlights is to lean into shared interests. Back in my corporate days, I was all about golf. But these days, my swing's too rusty and the greens feel too big. So I looked for something fresh and found it in community theater. I'd never acted a day in my life, but there was a senior troupe putting on a 1-act comedy at the community college. I signed up, jittery as all get out, and discovered that nothing bonds you faster than rehearsing lines under hot stage lights. Now, every Tuesday and Thursday, I'm stepping into someone else's shoes, literally, and sharing the stage with folks who've become some of my dearest friends, right? If theater's not your thing, Levin suggests volunteering for a cause you love. Maybe it's at the local food bank, the animal shelter, or a veterans support group. I started volunteering at our town's historical museum, helping visitors trace their family roots in old census records. Turns out, you meet the nicest people when you're leafing through dusty ledgers. I've made friends with folks half my age who bring fresh energy and tech know-how. Now, here's a spicy little twist. Don't wait for an invitation. Send one. I've got a friend, Lou, out in Boise, who's famous for hosting what she calls Airmail Friday. She writes 5 postcards every Friday morning and mails them to folks she hasn't heard from in a while. Doesn't matter if they live across town or across the country, there's something magical about finding a card in your mailbox on a crisp morning. Am I right? I gave it a whirl myself, and last week I received a postcard from an old buddy in New Orleans asking if I'd like to join his virtual Jews Appreciation Club. Suddenly, I'm tuning into live streams of street performers down Bourbon Street without hopping on a plane. It's those unexpected connections that keep life lively, all right. As we move into our final point, let me share what I call the growth mindset mantra Levin champions. Friendships after 70 aren't about quantity. They're about quality, curiosity, and consistency. It's better to have 2 or 3 pals you check in with regularly than a dozen you only see at funerals. Okay. So, I challenge you to pick one person right now. Yes, right now. Take out your phone or a pen and paper and reach out. Suggest a phone date, a quick coffee, or even a virtual museum tour. That single step can light up both your day and theirs, right?